Free Craigslist mower with a 4.5 horsepower Briggs and Stratton engine. The ad said, old mower, new carburetor, tired of working on it, come and get it. Here's how I tested for, located, and repaired a vacuum leak that was causing the engine to surge, and how you can do it as well. If your lawnmower runs but the engine surges and you have this classic style of Briggs and Stratton engine with the Pulsa Prime carburetor on the side mounted on top of the gas tank, here's a way you can test that engine for a vacuum leak, which can cause surging. This is my pressure washer. It also has a classic style Briggs and Stratton engine. I could test this one for a vacuum leak the same way. But here's how you do that test. Remove your air filter from the side. Flathead screwdriver, take this bolt out. Air filter will lift off. Crank the mower. Place your thumb about halfway across the throat of the carburetor. See if it changes the engine speed. You may have to adjust your thumb a little bit, block off more or a little less, and see if it affects the engine speed. Here's what I'm talking about. If you try that and it does level out your engine speed like it did with mine, that's telling you air is leaking in somewhere else. It could be at the base of the carburetor. Your gasket could have gone bad down here, or it could be at the intake manifold, which is where I found my problem. And if you notice a different carburetor on the engine now, you are correct. This is the one that was on the engine when I did the vacuum leak testing. I took this brand new one off. I'm going to put it on my pressure washer. I put this used carburetor onto this mower, cleaned it out with carburetor spray, and replaced the diaphragm and gasket underneath. When I crank it up to show you that it runs fine, this is the carburetor that's on it. And the brand new one's going on the pressure washer. The next thing I did was take 2 1/4-inch bolts off that hold the dipstick onto the engine cover. Then I took 3 3/8-inch bolts that hold the engine cover on. And this is all with the engine still running. I carefully lifted the engine cover off, being careful not to touch the flywheel, because with the engine running, that flywheel is spinning. That gave me access to the intake manifold, which fits into the carburetor on this end and bolts down to the engine over here. And over here is where I found the leak. Next, with the engine still running, I took carburetor spray and I sprayed it right at the base of the intake manifold. There's a gasket there between the manifold and the engine, and as I sprayed that carburetor spray, the engine speed changed because that spray was being drawn into the engine, sucked into the engine. That's where the leak was. You'll see in this clip. You saw it and you heard it. Every time I sprayed carburetor spray at the base of the intake manifold, the engine speed changed and it leveled out. That's a clear indication that there was an air leak right here at the base of the intake manifold. If you check this location with the carb spray and you don't hear a change in the surging, you can also check here where the intake manifold plugs into the carburetor. So do the carb spray thing down here, and that may be where your leak is. Also, between the carburetor and the gas tank, there's a gasket that seals that gap, and that gasket can fail as well. Put some carb spray at the base all the way around, and if there's a vacuum leak, that carb spray will be drawn into the engine and you'll hear a change in the engine speed. You can also check the screws to make sure they're tight. Sometimes they can work loose over time due to the vibration of the mower. And if you don't find a leak here, or here, or here, spray some along the length of the intake manifold, because sometimes cracks can develop, hairline cracks, that you might not be able to see. So take your carburetor spray. It's really helpful if you have this straw on the end so that you can direct the flow, and spray some underneath all the way down the intake manifold. And if there is a crack, it'll be drawn into the engine and you'll hear the change in engine speed. And lastly, you can take the intake manifold completely off. Check the underside for cracks. There may be a crack underneath that you can't see and that you don't get to with the carburetor sprays. To order the correct replacement part, I needed a model number for the engine. It's stamped right here in the metal on the front of the engine cover, just above the spark plug, right here on the left side. And for this mower, the Briggs and Stratton part number is 699644. That came with the intake manifold and gasket. Let me disconnect the spark plug just to be sure the engine doesn't accidentally fire off. 2 1/4-inch bolts on top of the ignition coil. There's a wire connecting it below, so just be careful with that. 2 more 1/4-inch bolts holding the intake manifold on. Now this end of the intake manifold will lift straight up and the other end will pull out of the carburetor. There's an O-ring and a retaining ring at this end. Make sure you keep track of those. It may stay in the carburetor, I hope so. Nope, popped out. This is the O-ring, the rubber one. The hard plastic is the retaining ring. I'll reinstall these on the new intake manifold. Now here's the old intake manifold that came off, completely flat across the bottom. Here's the new one that I ordered, the correct part based on my model number, Briggs and Stratton part, and they're different. This one's completely flat, this one has a raised section. So I think that someone, in an effort to repair this, put on a different intake manifold, and that may be what contributed to the air leak. Also, they made a homemade gasket out of a cardboard box, which I've heard can work, but in this case it did not. So the combination of this intake manifold and the homemade gasket was not sealing. That's where the air leak was. I placed a new gasket on the engine, lining up the holes for the bolts. Now the new intake manifold, the retaining ring goes on first, then the O-ring. This is the end that slides into the carburetor. Line it up with the holes for the bolts. I'll get the bolts threaded by hand so I know I don't strip them out. I'm also going to tighten it down by hand rather than with the drill, because that intake manifold is made out of plastic and I don't want to over tighten the bolts and crack the plastic. Doing it by hand, you have a much better feel of when it's tight. Now the O-ring gets pushed into the opening at the carburetor. Now the retaining ring after that to hold the O-ring in. All right, the O-ring and retaining ring are in, so we're good there. We're good here, that's tight. Let me show you an easier way to reinstall the O-ring and retaining ring if yours happens to come out like mine did when you remove the intake manifold. The way I did it was the hard way, putting the retaining ring on first and then the O-ring. Then I had to take a flathead screwdriver and push the O-ring in all the way around, and then the retaining ring after that. I had to work it all the way around until it snapped in. An easier way is take the O-ring first, stick it into the opening in the carburetor, push it into place, then take the retaining ring, the snap ring, put that in place, and it'll snap right in. Then you slide the intake manifold in and it's sealed against the carburetor. You can do it the way I did it, but it's just a little more difficult and time consuming. Now the ignition coil gets put back on. When you're reinstalling the ignition coil, there should be a gap left between the flywheel and the ignition coil. You're actually supposed to use a feeler gauge, but what I've always done is use a business card. I put that business card between the ignition coil and the flywheel and tighten it down so that there's just a little bit of drag between the two. And that's always worked for me. Now engine cover back on. These 2 1/4-inch screws that hold the dipstick to the engine cover. Now the air filter on top of the carburetor. Spark plug. As you heard, it runs fine now. Easy fix for a free mower. If you have a surging engine but did not find a vacuum leak, check out the carburetor next. The diaphragm and the gasket at the base of the carburetor. Also get some carburetor spray and clean it out. Lots of videos showing you how to do that on YouTube. And check out the link down below to the video showing you how to change out that diaphragm and gasket. Hope this helps. Thanks for watching.